Hello there, and welcome back to Modern World History with Dustin Fowler. Today we're going to look at the next part of our exploration unit, and this is going to finish us up, is we're looking at the Asian exploration, the Chinese and the Japanese in particular, that kind of took place roughly the same time frame as the exploration that was happening in Europe. So if you remember from looking at European exploration, we're looking at really a movement that was in line with Renaissance ideals and humanism and curiosity and secularism and all these different things. But the Chinese, actually, a very different culture. They had already kind of undergone their golden, some of their golden era, and they actually got around to exploring the area around their country far before. I say far before, maybe about 100 years or so before the Europeans had begun. And this started happening during the Ming Dynasty and the time frame that you see right here off to the side. And so Emperor Yongle had an admiral, is Zheng He. And now when you see this ZH, anytime when you're looking at the pronunciation of Chinese words that have been alphabetized, this is going to have a J sound. Okay, so we're looking at Zheng He, and this one here is not he, but is actually going to be pronounced He. All right, so this really goes for any word like this. You look at the Zhou dynasty, one of the earlier dynasties of Chinese history, and it's the same kind of thing. This ZH is always going to make a J sound, like a J sound. So just for pronunciation there, I might not pronounce everything right. You look back at my unit 2, but by golly, I know that part. So Zheng He was an admiral. He was also a eunuch or a slave of, that had risen up to being like a high-ranking admiral that he became. He also was a Muslim, which is not something that you would expect. But so there's a lot of things here with Zheng He that may not be the norm, but nevertheless a very, very influential individual nonetheless. And he led a series of voyages throughout the Asian Pacific, and in particular the 7 voyages of the Chinese treasure fleet. And if you want to look at what that might have looked like, this right here is going to be an example of a treasure ship that he would have sailed in. And so these are massive ships. The Caravel, or I guess as a point of reference, the particular Santa Maria ship that was being sailed by Christopher Columbus, was very, very small in comparison to Zheng He's treasure fleet ship. So maybe not all of the treasure fleet ships looked like the one that Zheng He was on, but they were very, very large nonetheless. And just like the name might entail, they carried with them just a huge amount of treasure that they would go all across the Asian Pacific looking for different groups to give it to. Now wait a second, it wasn't that simple. Basically, they were looking for countries that would offer them tribute. So they were looking for tribute from neighboring peoples. Now remember, we looked at tribute earlier. Tribute is like a in the context we looked at it, it was being used as somewhat of a protection tax, but usually is a tax that is imposed by a more powerful group. And they can say maybe for protection, but in this case, the Chinese were trying to get slick with it. Okay, by a powerful country. Okay, and so what they were trying to do is they were trying to get countries to kind of ongoingly pay them, some kind of tribute, or give them some kind of tribute. And really, it was an act of loyalty, probably more so than anything else. But in return for this, these people would have to acknowledge China as like the supreme empire, and they would have to perform what the Europeans saw as a humiliating ritual called the Kowtow, and which was basically, you get on all fours, you put your face to the ground, your head touches the ground before the Chinese emperor. And this here, if you are a leader and you're doing this, is almost like an act of just extreme humility towards another ruler. And so you can imagine that this was not something that very many European rulers would want to do, but a lot of people wanted to do this because they were given so much treasure by the Chinese in response for this. So if they were willing to humble themselves more or less between the Chinese, who saw themselves as completely superior, they would receive just a huge amount of treasure. Now, Europeans, like I said, found this to be very, very expensive, offensive. And so the George III was asked to do this, and we're just like, heck no, we're not gonna lower ourselves in such a way. That's ridiculous, right? But others in the region wanted Chinese treasures, and so they did. This gave China very much dominating. They were a dominant force in the region. Now they still today, and if you look at the South, China Sea and all this other stuff, that all this dispute that's going on in modern politics, that kind of has its root in this. China has always been the dominant force going back to this time period, and maybe even a little before and after, and they wanted to kind of continue to exert their influence, even at the expense of international law. And so you see that even today. But others in the region, like I said, wanted Chinese treasure. And even the Dutch were willing to kowtow in order to get in on that. Now, they were probably the only Europeans that were willing to do this. But here's the thing that's kind of weird about it, is that China dominated the region with many countries paying this tribute, all right? But after the 7th voyage, the Chinese withdrew into isolation. They just stopped cold turkey with these voyages and kind of just changed the policy, changed the way that they viewed themselves in the greater context. And so by the time that the treasure fleets were over and done, the Europeans had already begun exploring and had really started to get, really deep into it. China only traded with them at 3 ports, but in practice, more trade was happening. So the government only enabled 3 ports, but we know that, people are going to do what they're going to do, right? And so the Europeans were actually doing far more trade than that with China. Europeans began to spread technology and culture, and the Chinese culturally opposed industry and merchants. And so you think about how Europeans went from, the Renaissance and exploration, and then eventually they're going to start collecting raw materials through exploration, and eventually they're going to start industrialization over time. But the Chinese, many people think, well, why in the world didn't the Chinese get in on that? Because they seem to have a head start. The Chinese, they honored agriculture, right, or farmers. They thought that agriculture. They thought that farming was just was the job that they wanted to have. Socially, that it was just held in higher esteem than merchants, who they thought were shady people who just wanted money, and industries. And so they actually just kind of took a step back and didn't do the industries and merchants in the same way that the Europeans were doing during this time period. So in a lot of ways, they just kind of stepped back and allowed the Europeans to have first dibs. So it's one of those historical questions that we may never know the answer to. Under the Manchu and Qing dynasty, or the Qing dynasty, which was a Manchu dynasty, they continued isolation. The Dutch performed the kowtow, as I mentioned, and so they did trade with the Chinese. But other countries wanted to do this as well. Other European countries wanted to do trade, but they refused to kowtow. But they didn't refuse to stop and just be like, oh, that's okay, we're never going to do trade with China. They increasingly worked their way into China and gained a stronger foothold that we are going to look at in a later unit. Meanwhile, Japan is very, very close situated to China in Asia, and very, very, we think about Japanese today being a major influencer in Asia, but they were, during the time, they were a feudal society in the same way that Europeans were during the Middle Ages. All right, so a very, very isolated group. The emperor existed and was seen as a god in Japanese society, but really, Daimyo, all right, this word here, Daimyo, they were the ones who called all the shots in European politics. They were local warlords or feudal lords who controlled large pieces of territory throughout Japan, and they were the ones with the real power. Now, there was this one guy, Oda Nobunaga, who killed his rivals in order to gain power, and he was the first to really effectively use guns in battle. Toyotomi Hideyoshi began unifying Japan, and Tokugawa Ieyasu finished the job and became a shogun, or the shogun, or sole ruler of Japan. So we went from this feudal society where local rulers called Daimyo controlled and called all the shots to eventually Tokugawa Ieyasu. This guy here is going to become the first shogun, meaning he's going to be the one over all the other warlords and all the other territories. So almost like a king. Now, here's the thing, is that he had the power, but he controlled more or less the emperor. So the emperor of Japan would always serve whatever the shogun was going to be, as somewhat more of a figurehead. Again, they held him in high esteem as a god, but the shogun had all the political power. The Tokugawa Shogunate was established, or I guess established order in Japan. Europeans made contact with Japan as early as the 1500s. By the 1600s, Japan was completely sick of them, thought of them as a perversion to Japanese culture. Ieyasu saw Christianity as a major threat, and so he banned it by 1612. At first, they wanted European weapons. As you know, from what we just discussed, some of these daimyo and eventually the shogun used gunpowder as a way of beating down his enemies. But eventually they're going to have worn out their welcome, and the Japanese are going to not want Europeans in there at all. And so there were rebellions that convinced Japanese shoguns that Christians were not good for Japan. He ousted missionaries and ended the practice of Christianity, and then closed their doors, so to speak, to Europeans until the 1800s. And so Japan is going to be one of the truly isolated empires, or truly isolated countries, during most of the time where a lot of this global expansion was occurring. So that's it for exploration. Thank you very much for your time, and I will see you in the start of the next unit in Modern World History. Thank you very much.